Clayton, I can't promise that I'm not going to bring up shit about the fucking Romans or the fucking Ottomans or whoever the hell. I mean, I can't help but talk about real world shit, so I'm sorry.
As long as it's some real world shit that like pretty much no one would argue about, like Nazis are bad. But if you start arguing about like the merits of making sure that the trains run on time, I think I'll cut that. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Kyle.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us. Today we are talking about evil cultures in D&D. Can they hold themselves together enough to even be considered a culture? Can they even exist? As we've been preparing to talk about this, we've just kind of been bullshitting a little bit before we started recording this. And yeah, this is a much bigger topic than I was expecting. And I'm starting to think that we might not be able to get through hardly any of the material that we have to talk about in this one episode.
Yeah, this one's going to go deep. I can tell already. Where do we want to start with this monster?
Well, since we're talking about evil, I think we should define what evil is, especially because in D&D, evil is an absolute thing. It is something that is it is a game statistic, and in previous editions, it was something that you could unequivocally determine about another character. So I'm going to let's just start off talking about chaotic evil, and we'll see how long that runs. And then if we've got time, we'll go into the other forms of evil and talk about how that might affect culture. I'm going to start off by giving the quite expansive definition of chaotic evil that is given in the 5th edition D&D book, the Player's Handbook. Chaotic evil creatures act with arbitrary violence, spurred by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. End of definition. So it's looking like the main thing about evil, chaotic evil, is it just doesn't give a fuck about anybody else other than number one.
And there's a methodology thing there, right? It's not just priority, because all the evils worry about number one the most, which is a pretty bizarre way to classify evil, in my opinion. But there's also that bit about the arbitrary violence. So there's no plan, there's no premeditation necessarily. It's a, what would you say, like a childlike kind of evil. It's like I see it and I want it, and I'll club you over the head if you try to take it from me.
I think certainly instinctual and like perpetuated by entities that have no control, whether it's self-imposed or otherwise, over their instincts.
That's another big question there that you just brought up, of control. Is this something that things choose to do, or is this just in their nature?
Well, according to the D&D books, where a particular alignment is a fact of the character, I think it's interpreted to be a fundamental aspect of a person or a species. And to change that is possible, to go against that is possible. There are examples in the fiction, but by and large, it is a fundamental aspect of a person and of an entire species.
How are humans considered by default by D&D? It's not neutral, right? It's like neutral good.
I think it's unaligned.
Unaligned.
A lot of the humanoid races are like usually something. So like orcs are usually chaotic evil. Mm-hmm. Elves, I want to say, are usually chaotic good. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think they just kind of copped out with people who are in the middle and just gave them unaligned rather than true neutral.
That definition of chaotic evil bothers me in a bunch of different ways, but I'm thinking about, I guess the main thing we're talking about here is a culture. We got to hammer down a little bit more on what would qualify to say if, a chaotic evil group of whatever size could constitute a culture. From other fiction, I'm thinking about things like Klingons. Somebody might say, especially like, when they're at war, seem like they have chaotic evil properties, right? They're very orc-like in the way that they're described in their behavior and stuff. But at the same time, they've got honor codes that are like strict things. They've got these ancient traditions that they'll literally die to maintain. So, yeah, this is not...
With the Klingons, I think it's more of the way it's portrayed seems to be more kind of like how in medieval Japan there was the samurai code and all of that. But then once you got into like the way that individuals or armies or like city-states operated, yeah, they had all those codes and stuff. But when it came to war, war is war and you want to win.
Yeah, and that bit about arbitrary violence is super subjective, because what one person would take as, a minor ignorable kind of slight, another one is going to be ready to, duel to the death over the dishonor of, of a comment or whatever. So yeah, what violence is arbitrary?
I see the arbitrariness of violence as kind of like the stereotypical school bully who will just shove people into lockers or just hit people in the back of the head just for fun. I see a lot of chaotic evil as being just for fun. At least that's how it comes across in the games itself. And whenever I see players who are following the chaotic evil alignment, they're just doing things for shits and giggles. They're just intentionally fucking with the rest of the world for their own lulls.
That might be true from an individual character perspective, but we're talking about cultures here, so thinking about how that kind of behavior has a function in a group, on small scales, you see this in like, groups of apes, and wolves and whatever. Lots of mammals behave this way, that there's one alpha that will occasionally, do some kind of show of force, to maintain their place at the top. And they're the leader, they have they create a coherence to the whole unit. And, occasionally people or other members of the group will challenge them violently and, they'll get put down, whatever. But if there wasn't that bully at the top, it would just be a bunch of individuals. There would be no social unit to speak of, right?
Yeah, and I would say that if particularly chaotic evil, to have a culture, to have a cohesive group, it's mostly ruled by fear from whoever is at the top and whoever has the most authority, and most authority through violence, through direct violence.
For sure. Yeah.
And because of that, I don't see chaotic evil groups as getting too large. Like maybe a small village as being probably the top end of what can be day-to-day managed for a chaotic group or a chaotic evil group.
I think that every large society, once it gets to the point of its decline, probably becomes chaotic evil in some ways. Like, when let's say the Aztecs are just collapsing, their environment's collapsing, their crops are collapsing, they don't know what the hell is going on. They're just piling up bodies, just cutting hearts out of people and just doing every crazy fucking thing they can think of to try to turn things around because things are getting desperate, you know? When Rome was collapsing, when it had been sacked, and what's left is this, like, you know, weird early Dark Ages, like, wasteland of a city that used to be the center of the European world. You know, it's just everybody for themselves. You know, leading up to the shit hitting the fan, I would think that all the rats on the sinking ship eventually start clawing and biting at each other, right?
That seems to be what happens whenever societies collapse from a combination of internal and external forces. I mean, Rome fell mostly from internal stuff, and then it was just the barbarians at the gate who finally just came through and ended things, put a merciful end to all of the internal decay.
I don't know how merciful it was, but that's a discussion for another time, I think. I think that also I disagree on your assertion about the size of the society, because I think it depends on what's motivating it. If it is just like one tough guy dictator, some tyrant that's, you know, keeping everybody under heel, I mean, that once it gets to a certain scale becomes, you know, has very much the look of a lawful evil sort of civilization. But as far as the chaotic stuff, I think to get that at scale, you have to have religion. I think you have to have some really wacky ass religion to get, you know, like mass human sacrifice and, you know, nutty shit like that. I mean, I would argue that there are pretty good periods of time for the history of the Catholic Church when it was very much a chaotic evil sort of institution in Europe.
I feel like a chaotic evil organized religion would look like, what is it called? Discordianism. Have you ever heard of that, either of you guys?
You mean from the Illuminatus trilogy?
Yeah, it's like this, idea that nothing within it makes sense. I don't actually know that much about it, but I remember in high school, a buddy of mine was trying to explain it to me, and it just seems like just like celebrating random acts of like things breaking down would be more appropriate. Maybe I'm not sure.
Jordan, I definitely think that you're on something there about, like, if you're going to try to get something very large, there needs to be some greater external force imposing some sort of order upon it or some sort of structure on it, where you said religion would be probably the thing that would have to do it. Like in D&D, orcs, they have their religion where they follow Grumsh, their god, and the dictates of Grumsh is that you are this physical badass who just doesn't take shit from anybody, and you just cut your way through your enemies. The greatest joy in life is to see your enemies driven before you, hear the lamentations of the women.
Kyle, to your point about the Discordians, I would call that a chaotic neutral. It's been a while since I've read the Illuminatus trilogy, but my recollection of them is that they don't revel in cruelty. It's more like the glee of seeing people's plans and revered institutions get, you know, undermined or, you know, crumble or be made fools of. I don't remember there being any kind of like hatefulness or greediness about it necessarily. This is digging way back in my memory though. But like, I don't know, I guess the best example I could think of I don't know how religious it is, because when you're talking about ancient societies, the religion and the politics are just completely intermingled. But what about like the Mongols, right? You're talking about like a gigantic army and like butchery, the likes of which we'll probably never see again. as a species. To my knowledge, it wasn't, one of these like pharaonic kind of, divine leader sort of deals, was it? Did they think about Genghis Khan that way? I don't know.
My understanding, although my understanding is quite a few years old, and I'm trying to reach back in my memories about it, but my understanding is that like Genghis Khan just ruled from charisma and basically said, "Hey guys, if we join together, we can really take everything that we want from the rest of the world," and was able to deliver in basically small scale raids, and that just snowballed into literally all of the steppe joining with him in order to just go out into the world. And while they were incredibly butcherous, while they did just kill, they always killed with a plan. Like the first city they came to, they just fucking killed everybody. And then the next city they said, "Hey, remember us? We're the people who just turned that city over there into rubble. Give us everything you've got, or else the same will happen to you." They did kill a lot of people, but they only killed the people who resisted after the initial, basically, onslaught.
Mm-hmm. And as far as their tactics go, they definitely were chaotic in nature. That's part of the terror of their tactics. They were not, in these like Roman phalanxes or anything. They're riding around wildly and just raining arrows down on people, and it's just, danger in all directions. So though they might have had an overall strategy coming from the strong man up top, on the scale of the individual riders, like it's just kind of like total madness, right?
Yeah, and in the whenever it came to warfare, yeah, it was. They were the inheritors of the Scythians or Parthians. I'm sorry, their tactics where you fire arrows, and then when people come at you, since you're on a horse, you just ride away and you continue firing arrows, and nobody will ever catch you.
Yep.
Like particularly the Mongols are a very, I think looking at them as an example, they definitely go from, I would say their tactics and their persona go from chaotic evil under Genghis Khan, but then by the time Kublai Khan, his grandson, came up, they were very organized. Kublai basically, when Genghis's empire fractured when he died, Kublai was the one who basically reforged it and defeated all the other successors and stuff and came out on top. And he really implemented a lot of law into what became the Golden Horde, and basically turned it into a bureaucracy because he saw how well it worked in China for organizing mass numbers of people. So I think that using Mongols as an example of chaotic evil, how a society might form works, but as far as how a chaotic evil culture perpetuates, they had to go to a more lawful outlook in order to hold on to what they had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm struggling to think of a empire in history, of a civilization in history that you could have an argument would be chaotic evil that lasted over a period of time at scale. Yeah, I think it pretty much has to be a transitive stage, which makes sense. It's nature of chaos, right? It's either going to be the primordial version of something, or it's going to be the end of something and its collapse. So, rises from chaos, returns to chaos. In the middle, there's going to be some period of relative order to things. Yeah, I think that adds up. Well, solved that one.
I still kind of want to talk about how like different aspects of chaotic evil would form into or would impact different areas of culture itself, the way that people interact in their daily lives. Um, like if we're looking at chaotic evil as being this arbitrary violence for greed and bloodlust and just getting your own, wealth becomes something that is incredibly tenuous because you are just a knife in the back away from losing literally everything that you have, including your life.
Yeah, I think that's probably where a lot of the kind of Darwinian impetus for honor culture comes from. That you can only trust someone so much who you're paying to watch your back. But if people actually have loyalty to you because you've proven yourself to be trustworthy to them, and treat people fairly, and you're an honorable person, that's much more valuable than however many mercenaries that you can purchase. So your wealth becomes your circle, your trusted allies. And I like thinking about that Mongol example. You couldn't really expect anything like a culture to exist, I think, if every single individual within it is operating in the way that or is treating each other the way that that culture is treating its neighbors who it's invading and raiding and whatever. If everyone's at each other's throats like that, I think you would have like a failed state situation. You'd have something like Somalia or the DRC. Like it'd just be a bunch of little petty warlords, and random psychopaths running around. There's always in cultures a sense, some definition of us and them. That's part of what defines a culture, right? You've got some idea of sort of a membrane around you, right? So this is one of those places where I think D&D alignment's probably just way too hollow for stuff like this. Yeah, the law for the Romans or the British or whoever is going to be handed down totally differently to the barbarians.
Sorry, go ahead, Kyle.
Are chaotic cultures even capable of having an us, or is everyone a them?
I think that, well, in D&D, like the races, you have a clearly defined racial aspect to what is an us. If you're an orc, anybody with the green skin and tusks and all that, that is an us, but it is an us that you can take advantage of. They do have their cohesion from being able to say that their religion says that orcs are superior to all other creatures because we are so bloodthirsty, and I think that's where they draw that distinction from, and that's where in some of the, well, it's varied over the years, but in what scant lore we get about the orcs and stuff, it goes back and forth as to whether or not half orcs are considered a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes it's considered a good thing if that culture sees the orc as bringing strength into the species, but most of the time a half orc would be considered it's a shame because it is polluting that which is an orc. But I really don't think that there's much other. There are many other things that define orcs as into those different smaller groups. There's also clans and tribes, and different clans and different tribes war with each other. But again, that comes down to their religion, because their religion preaches that Grumsh wants combat. He wants orcs to prove themselves, and so an individual orc tribe will prove its strength against its neighbors, and it doesn't care who those neighbors are, whether or not they are humans or elves, or whether they are other orcs. They're going to be doing that, and that's kind of how their us versus them is defined as I see it.
This is a bit out of left field, but I wonder if we're being too narrow in our definition of violence. Maybe some no longer primitive, some established society that is chaotic evil gets its random acts of violence like verbally or through like violent trade overtures, or they're still ruining people and fucking everything over, but they're not doing it in a way that causes like wanton destruction and loss of life.
Yeah, I definitely think you're onto something there, like where we are being pretty narrow with our definition of violence. In games and stuff, and not just D&D, but like computer games that very often draw their inspiration from D&D, like World of Warcraft and stuff. Like the overall offensiveness of like an orc or a chaotic evil individual is not just limited to the violence that they can perpetrate, the physical violence, but it's also them being very brash, being very standoffish. They're quick to verbally insult other people and just physically impose on them and things like that. And that's beyond physical violence, getting into other forms of violence that seems to be more prevalent in chaotic evil culture.
I think we've also got a pretty narrow definition of chaos here, such as we have a definition. If I could throw in a little bit from outside of Dungeons and Dragons. So in the Elric and Melniboné stories, Stormbringer stuff from Michael Moorcock, there's two civilizations that I think are pretty interesting to contrast, that are both I'd say devout followers of chaos, but very different in the way that they do things. The first one is Elric's civilization, the Melnibonéans. They have this bright empire, it's called. It's ruled over the world for 10,000 years or something. Their patron is one of the archdukes of hell. They are unbelievably evil. One of their versions of high art in their culture is they will get hundreds of slaves that were selected for the pitch of their screams, and they will have torturers who are being led by a musician who's composed a piece specifically to be played by torturing these slaves, and their screams are the notes of the piece. Like that's how they do orchestras in Melniboné. And they're not bad to each other, really. Like one Melnibonéan to the other, they might have like, Machiavellian intrigue or whatever. But the slaves are humans, and Melnibonéans, just as context, are roughly elves, you could say. George R.R. Martin pretty much completely stole the Targaryens from Michael Moorcock, that's Melnibonéans. They're all about dragons and things like that. But anyway, they've held this empire together, and it's in decline in the point of the books. They've got their one little, castle island, and they just lay around like smoking opium and stuff and like doing weird magical shit. Meanwhile, the human race has started to develop kingdoms called the Young Kingdoms outside of their borders. And one of those is sort of vying for position in the good graces of chaos, which in this cosmology is, a collection of, gods or whatever that are mostly evil, but not necessarily, and are more about just, change, but also a lot of evil. But they're the Pantangians, and they're like the most horrendous kind of thing you can imagine. They're almost like the Reavers from help me out. Firefly. Yeah, they're almost like a medieval version of the Reavers from that. They'll speak, they're conversant and stuff, but they're absolutely like, brutal barbaric type people, and they worship all of these fucking crazy like Cthulhu-esque chaos gods. And Ulrich makes multiple observations about how the Pantangians are worshiping chaos, and it's unnatural to them as humans to do so, and so it all seems like very perverse and like horrible. But like in imitation of them, they've got their city surrounded by these statues, these screaming statues, that are people that have been turned to stone by the theocrat who runs Pantang. But these people are still conscious inside their stone bodies, and the only thing that they can do is scream. And so they scream forever in excruciating pain around their capital. But Elric makes the point that Melnibonéans were born to chaos. This was a natural thing for them, and though they did wicked things, it was never decaying to them, to their society. Their society decayed because they got completely uninspired by the world. It was this ennui that pretty much wiped them out. They'd ruled for millennia, but eventually they just got sick of living, more or less. But yeah, those are two very different takes on large civilizations and how they might pursue chaos as a bedrock belief. I just rambled for a long time. I hope any of that was interesting.
It does help bring some context. You were talking about them being kingdoms. So that's kind of on the upper end of what we've been discussing as far as how chaos can maintain itself. It sounds like in those books, I still haven't gotten around to reading them. I've got them on my shelf, not more than an arm's reach from me right now. But if we're looking at them as chaotic kingdoms, it does still sound like there is the structure is coming, well, particularly from the Melnibonéans, that they are their own distinct species or race, and so they gain a lot of their context of what their culture is from that, where Elric is specifically excluding the human version of basically chaos because it's different from what his culture sees chaos.
Yeah, well, that's not what I meant to say. It's more like he's an elitist about it. He's basically like, of the position that the Melnibonéans can handle chaos, can use it, for their own desires, and that it's a natural relationship between Melnibonéans and chaos, whereas humans are like, they look at them as an inferior race, Melnibonéans to humans, and it's sort of like looking at a chimpanzee that found a gun. It's kind of like the vibe.
Might be the closest we've been able to get to an existing example of this kind of society. I feel like you've explained more about that series in the past 10 minutes than I've known in the past years of knowing you. It's kind of cool.
It's sweet, man. It's fresh in my mind. I just finished the last book, and I'd forgotten how good it was.
So in those books, where does the Melnibonéans, like, within their race, where does their where does their hierarchy come from? Do they have a hierarchy?
They've got the emperor. They've got a royal line. Elric is, 428th emperor of Melniboné. It's, hereditary empire. And then there's, nobles and stuff, and then there's like commoner Melnibonéans. But there's not that many Melnibonéans. Like, they all live on this one little island. And on this island is really like one big city. And that's it. And it doesn't get into a whole lot about, what happened in the centuries and millennia prior to this, but you get the vibe that there used to be a bunch of something like governors and like, Melnibonéan settlements out in what's now the Young Kingdoms. But, there's been a series of rebellions and, all these little upstart nations have formed, and, maybe the oldest of them might be a few hundred years old or something. But yeah, they're still the economic superpower at the beginning of the books, and people like the human kings will still pay them tribute and stuff like that, but they're just not that involved in anything, especially once Elric becomes the emperor. Like, he just doesn't even want to be the emperor, and so it kind of becomes this, he hands it over to his cousin, and his cousin's like sort of inept, and the whole thing's just kind of like in decline at that point. But literally most of Melnibonéans just lay around in like dream states. Their capital city is called Imrir, and the human name for it is the Dreaming City. They're all just fucking high all the time.
What in that society, where obviously they were a massively influential power, but when a society reaches something like that point where they are, and this does still kind of tie in, where they're not interested in engaging with other external places in any meaningful way. I guess if they're fairly chaotic in that sense still, what stops other societies from banding together or doing whatever to just come in and take advantage of this fictional society's lack of order?
People are terrified of Melniboné. When people see a Melnibonéan wandering around out in the world, it's like a big deal, and people run away. They've had such a close relationship, not only with the Lords of Chaos, but also with the Elemental Lords, which are their own thing, and lots of weird sorcery besides. That, there's all these wild stories about all the nightmarish shit that Melnibonéans are capable of, and probably a lot of it was true. And they, on top of that, they've got a shitload of dragons that they keep in this eyrie on the island, and they can bring them out once in a while, and the dragons are just fucking hell on earth, as you can imagine. But then they sleep for a long time after they use them, so they use them sparingly. But they've also got this gigantic fleet of these like huge battle barges that are described as being like fucking aircraft carriers just covered in catapults and stuff. Bigger than anything that anybody else has. So like the technology that they developed is way ahead of whatever else is going on. Like, you could probably put their technology at something like maybe the Renaissance, whereas the Young Kingdoms, it would be generous to say that most of them are in the Bronze Age. Yeah, for the most part, I think that's pretty accurate. But beyond that, the Melnibonéans ruled with such cruelty and overwhelming power for so long that, like, when humans see Elric walking around in his full, like, battle regalia and all this stuff, that's like, the known traditional, like, warrior gear of the Melnibonéans, they feel this instinctual terror looking at this figure. It's like a mouse looking at a snake. So, yeah, they're uniquely feared by the human race.
And so even though they are in decline, they've become like indulgent and sort of done doing anything but whatever it is they do, lounging around fucking high off their asses. they would be able to pull their ranks together enough to actually operate this military equipment, like, and you know, that's another aspect I hadn't thought of, like a chaotic evil society, a chaotic society. It takes a lot of dedication to what you're doing to put on that armor and get in your battle ranks and go to your warships to man them as a team and as a crew, and you know, to operate a 20-person crewed warship is an immense amount of discipline. I would say an immense amount of law, and so I'm getting really in the weeds here, but like it's another interesting idea to think of. In an era where any manner of technology exists, could a chaotic society get their shit together long enough to operate that technology?
Yeah, and this is one of the differences, I think, between the Stormbringer world and D&D in the way that they conceptualize chaos, because chaos is part of the cosmology, and there is no real good and evil in that. It's all law and chaos, and both of them can be evil in the extreme, and both of them are good in the right balance in relationship to each other. So like, and again, this is what I was getting at about like Melnibonéans are not at all chaotic in the sense of like behaving arbitrarily on an individual level. I'd say they're somewhat lawful in a lot of the way that, like, they're very traditional, and they've got that like deep love for their culture and reverence for their emperor and all this stuff, but to the cosmic power of chaos, they're absolutely subservient. And humans for the most part have sided with law in opposition to them. And another thing that doesn't come through in D&D as much is that chaos is where magic comes from for the most part. Law is largely a thing of science, things like that, like sorcery and all this weird shit that like breaks the laws of physics. I'm not saying that the forces of law don't have anything that is construed as supernatural on their side, but when they do, it's much, much more subtle, and, they're not like flaming broadsword. They're like a sword that glimmers in the light in just such a way and feels extra lightweight and is very sharp.
I think so. It's, I don't know. This is a very cosmological topic. Clayton, are we too far in the weeds here? How are you feeling?
I don't think there's anywhere that's too far in the weeds for this. An aspect of chaos seems to be, like, at least in D&D, and I don't know about in Elric, but on an individual level, chaos really represents a degree of freedom, like an ability to do things that in a rigidly structured society only certain people are able to do, or you only do at certain times, or there's some sort of prohibition against actions. Whereas in chaotic societies, there does seem to be a lot more freedom to do what you want when you want, provided somebody, like in a chaotic evil society, provided somebody bigger isn't there to stop you from doing it because it pisses them off. So I'm just trying to get over some more of these points. So like with freedom comes like not only the ability to do what you want, but it's also kind of assumed that you've got the freedom from obligation in order to do basically whatever it is that you want. So like how would chaotic evil affect like what a person does for fun, what they do for leisure, what they do, how that affects like what they're wearing, what they're, because these are like, whenever I think about culture, I think a lot of people, or I personally think a lot about like my culture is what I do when I don't have to when I don't have to do other things. So like leisure, dress, food and drink, like what I do with the resources that I have available to me. That seems to be like how I personally define culture. So like how would like what different ways would chaotic evil affect what people do in their spare time? You, Jordan, you were describing in Melnibone that they have orchestras of pain pretty much. What are other ways that leisure can be affected by this chaotic evil mindset?
We were talking about Rome in decline, and seeing the Colosseum stuff from various animals tearing people apart, shit like that. It's not so different than what I was describing about Melnibone. An infatuation with the petty cruelties. That seems like the sort of thing that'd be on brand for this kind of thing. I can't imagine much that would be exultant, luminous, inspired things like that.
Yeah, you bring up Rome makes me think about reading The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic by Mike Duncan. In it goes into pretty extensive detail about just kind of the mindset of the Roman senators and the Roman elite and their view of the Roman populace. And they really saw the Roman populace in terms that we would probably describe as chaotic evil. Like they were, as a whole, the plebs were just this group that was ruled by their whims, and their whims were shifted with the wind, and anybody could gain the favor of the mob for short amounts of time. And it was a terrifying thing for the Roman citizens to see that basically the populace rising up in order to follow some sort of charismatic leader for a short period of time. And that was one of talking about bread and circuses of the Colosseum games and stuff like that. That's kind of how the people in power kind of tried to curb that into ways that would keep the people happy in ways so that they didn't think too much about all of the horrible shit that was happening to them because of the policies and stuff of the Roman Senate and the Roman rulers.
I mean, they're not wrong. If chaos is a thing of creation and wild nature and instinct and all of this, then that is what all animals are born into, including humans. And if there is going to be something that tames that, it would have to be some more powerful, more cruel force. And if it does so in a repeated, predictable way, then you could call that lawful, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I think about this sometimes, like, if you would take just a newborn human and let them grow up outside of civilization, you have, one of these little feral kids, it's going to be something that we would call chaotic evil, I think. And if you had something that was, raised, a person that was raised with just slightly more discipline and values and things, just a little bit more than that, you'd have an ancient human. There's so much that went on back then that we just think of as being so completely repulsive by our modern standards, but like, it was normal to these people. And yeah, like you're dealing with a sea of like hungry, angry, cruel, like mentally 12-year-olds, something like that, in the Roman plebs, right? For the most part, they're not educated. They can't read. They're mostly just idiots trying to survive and breed.
That's certainly how the Roman aristocracy saw them.
I don't see how they could be anything else, until you've got, a real, like, educational system and, more modern values being instilled. You're just talking about just one step above living in a cave. What about Vikings? Are Vikings chaotic evil?
According to the History Channel documentary series Vikings, that is not in fact a documentary series, they do look pretty chaotic evil to me, as far as like just how much backstabbing and treachery and stuff goes on. But that might also be the fact that they're pulling a lot of their influence from the poetic Eddas of the Vikings themselves, but also from modern soap opera.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's like talking about Vikings, and like one of the ways that I see a chaotic society, but also a chaotic evil society kind of being visible in an individual, is like the vast differences of dress, the way people groom themselves. Like Vikings were notorious for being very for grooming themselves very well compared to pretty much everybody else who was around at the time. And they did all of these very, very personal, very intricate, like beard weavings and just tattooing. Like you wouldn't see two Vikings who looked the same, who were dressed the same, but you could look at them and say, "Oh yes, that was a Viking," just by looking at them, the way that they stood and the way that they walked and talked and dressed. And I see that as being like a way of personal expression in dress, and also just how you craft your appearance as being something that's kind of chaotic evil. And to draw that on a more moderate or a more modern parallel, like just kind of look at how in modern US, like the acceptance of, just in the past 25 years, like of tattoos and dyeing of hair to make just wildly vibrant colors that don't exist in nature. Like those are the types of things that I see like a chaotic evil or a chaotic society, but also it would be in a chaotic evil society, that personal expression would be something that each individual does to make them look unique. But then when an outside culture looks in on them, you can see, oh, the fact that they are dyeing their hair, that they are wearing those extravagant, personalized clothing, that definitely marks them as an individual a distinct individual culture, even though each individual in that culture looks completely different from everyone else.
Yeah, like, oh man, those neat freaks, those fucking weirdos, they don't all look the same, because unlike, or rather like us, who's just completely covered in layers of dirt and grime, and so we all look like just fucking identically filthy.
Yep. So we're at about an hour mark. Is there any other points that anybody wants to make before we move on to geek things?
I could ramble about this for hours, but I don't have anything that's like a burning thing I want to get off my chest here.
Okay, I think I hit not even half of my notes, but
can we get to this number 20 though? This self-reflection. This is an interesting topic, I think, if it means what I think you're getting at.
Yeah, it's more how an individual would see themselves and view what they're doing in their society, whether or not that they can see themselves as, well, whether or not they can look themselves in a mirror is basically kind of how I see it. And how being chaotic evil, just how they live with themselves.
Yeah, I think that everybody's the hero of their own narrative. And I don't think anybody thinks of themselves as evil pretty much ever. People, might feel guilt about a thing that they did. But I think people always wrap that in, well, it was a certain situation. There was all these factors and I was pushed to it. That nobody thinks of themselves, unless they're complete psychopaths, as being by nature evil. And I think that go for every member of a culture that somebody from the outside might classify as chaotic evil. I'm not even sure that on a societal level they would, any group would stand thinking of themselves in that way in the D&D context. That's a very specific interpretation.
Yeah, because like in the real world, if for most people, if an individual conforms with the norms of society, they see themselves as a good person who is fitting in with their society. It's a very positive thing to basically go with the flow and to do the things that are culturally acceptable and that are cultural norms for you. But then in D&D, where you have a game statistic that is saying this is evil, which is in the game synonymous with wrong, how does that jibe with the fact that there is this unequivocal good, there is this unequivocal evil, there is this unequivocal good, there is this unequivocal wrong, where you are like a chaotic evil orc and you are being an exemplar of the orc race, but then there is this thing that is completely outside and above you, and even outside and above your God, who is saying that there is this thing that is good, and good is right and evil is wrong, and you are wrong.
Right. That almost brings up like let's see, it wasn't Ralph Waldo Emerson. I can't remember the American philosopher guy who went on about this, about being, if you're born evil, it's not your fault. That's just the way you're made. And how can you really call that evil? If you're going to attribute blame there, then attribute it to the creator. But, if your society is something that we call chaotic evil, and, let's say they've got a law that every summer solstice you got to saw a baby in half, and you're just there sawing your baby in half, you're being a lawful good person in that society. You're doing exactly what the fucking laws told you to do. So it's kind of silly. Like, if you're chaotic evil in a chaotic evil country, you'd be like a paladin, right?
You would probably view yourself in those terms.
Well, I mean, to invert it, if you wanted to be the equivalent of a chaotic evil person, but you're coming from a chaotic evil context, then you'd have to be the, chivalric, hero.
It makes me wonder if in like D&D, we'll go back to that example, or we'll stay with that example. If like a bunch of dragons that are evil, if they consider themselves to be evil, and to them it's good, like it's almost like just semantics, like they're like, yeah, we're evil, this is great, this is awesome, this is the way to be. Anybody who goes around like helping the poor and slaying evil people and giving what they have so that others can have more, that's fucked up. That's disgusting.
I'm not even sure how much of that you see in D&D. I mean, the good examples that I can think of, like the, unarguably good examples, like, is a fucking Planetar gonna come out of the sky and, like, heal somebody of leprosy or something? These celestials have all kinds of, like, healing powers and blah, blah, blah. How often do you see that going on? It doesn't. They're doing their own thing. They're fighting demons. Why? Well, red versus blue. It's just the struggle they're in. So, I mean, whichever fucking side makes the harvest, that's the one you go with, right?
All right, I think I'm comfortable with moving on to geek things now.
I think I've tapped out my cerebral cortex here.
All right.
So I've got a couple YouTube series that I've been watching recently. One of them is called In Camera, and this channel explains how special effects are created without the use of digital manipulation. In the first episode, which is the one that got me started, they showed how to make the title card effect for John Carpenter's The Thing. So if you wanted to make movies and use practical effects to make your title cards, how you can do it in the style of John Carpenter's The Thing. Thought it was very cool. The other YouTuber that I've been watching a lot has been Zoe B. She has her first 3 videos are on H.P. Lovecraft on the topics of fear, madness, and knowledge. So I would say if you're thinking about running a Call of Cthulhu game, definitely watch those videos. She has a few other videos. She's been doing YouTube for a little more than 6 months now, so she's got a few additional videos that I would also recommend. One of them is Am I White Trash? Trash Food and the Diet of the Poor, talking about the cuisine of Appalachian West Virginia, which is very similar to the cuisine of Appalachian, Ohio, which is where I'm from.
Yep. My geek thing would be a new Netflix show. I believe it's pronounced Fauda, Fauda. I believe that word means chaos, in either in Hebrew or Arabic or both. But it's like a modern kind of military drama that circles around this group of Israeli plainclothes special forces guys, and this one guy who's coming out of retirement, and then there's this family of Palestinians who one of their family members is this Bin Laden kind of like terrorist mastermind dude or whatever that kind of faked his own death, but he's secretly sneaking around still doing stuff. But it's a really compelling show. It's really well done. The acting is solid, the writing is solid, and it does a remarkably good job of painting a fair picture of the circumstances. I definitely feel like watching this show that it paints both sides as having their fair share of assholes and decent people and victims in between, which has always been, my professional take on the situation. But yeah, it's a pretty solid show. I'm a few episodes into it. I don't know if it stays solid, but I hope it does. Yeah, give it a look. Fauda.
I don't know if I have anything, to be completely honest. We got a new hot rod on Mars. That's pretty cool. I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, that is pretty damn cool.
It's got a fucking laser on it.
And a helicopter.
Yeah, man. It's like Airwolf on Mars.
There's a recent reference.
That I'm gonna make Airwolf my geek thing officially. Fuck you, Clayton.
All right, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Aye.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.